I honour you for the observation." And he profited by it, in so much that he confined his further remarks on elections to the end of the table, where he sat near Mr Bradshaw, and one or two equally eager, though not equally influential partisans of Mr Donne's. Meanwhile, Mr Farquhar took up Mr Benson's quotation at the end, where he and Jemima sat down near to Mrs Bradshaw and him. But in the present state of the world, as Mr Hickson says, it is rather difficult to act upon that precept. "Oh, Mr Farquhar!" said Jemima indignantly, the tears springing to her eyes with a feeling of disappointment, for she had been chafing under all that Mr Hickson had been saying, perhaps the more for one or two attempts on his part at flirtation with the daughter of his wealthy host, which she resented with all the loathing of a preoccupied heart. And she had longed to be a man, to speak out her wrath at this paltering with right and wrong. She had felt grateful to Mr Benson for his one clear short precept, coming down with a divine force against which there was no appeal, and now to have Mr Farquhar taking the side of expediency. It was too bad. "Nay, Jemima," said Mr Farquhar, touched and secretly flattered by the visible pain his speech had given. "Don't be indignant with me till I have explained myself a little more. I don't understand myself yet, and it is a very intricate question, or so it appears to me, which I was going to put, really, earnestly, and humbly, for Mr Benson's opinion. Now, Mr Benson, may I ask if you always find it practicable to act strictly in accordance with that principle? For if you do not, I am sure no man living can. Are there not occasions when it is absolutely necessary to wade through evil to good? I am not speaking in the careless, presumptuous way of that man yonder," said he, lowering his voice, and addressing himself to Jemima more exclusively. "I am really anxious to hear what Mr Benson will say on the subject, for I know no one to whose candid opinion I should attach more weight." But Mr Benson was silent. He did not see Mrs Bradshaw and Jemima leave the room. He was really, as Mr Farquhar supposed him, completely absent, questioning himself as to how far his practice tallied with his principle. By degrees he came to himself. He found the conversation still turned on the election, and Mr Hickson, who felt that he had jarred against the little minister's principles, and yet knew, from the carte du pays which the scouts of the parliamentary agent had given him, that Mr Benson was a person to be conciliated, on account of his influence over many of the working people, began to ask him questions with an air of deferring to superior knowledge that almost surprised Mr Bradshaw, who had been accustomed to treat Benson in a very different fashion, of civil condescending indulgence, just as one listens to a child who can have no opportunities of knowing better. At the end of a conversation that Mr Hickson held with Mr Benson, on a subject in which the latter was really interested, and on which he had expressed himself at some length, the young barrister turned to Mr Bradshaw, and said very audibly: "I wish Donne had been here. This conversation during the last half hour would have interested him almost as much as it has done me." Mr Bradshaw little guessed the truth, that Mr Donne was, at that very moment, coaching up the various subjects of public interest at Eccleston, and privately cursing the particular subject on which Mr Benson had been holding forth, as being an unintelligible piece of quixotism, or the leading dissenter of the town need not have experienced a pang of jealousy at the possible future admiration his minister might excite in the possible future member for Eccleston. And if Mr Benson had been clairvoyant, he need not have made an especial subject of gratitude out of the likelihood that he might have an opportunity of so far interesting Mr Donne in the condition of the people of Eccleston, as to induce him to set his face against any attempts at bribery. Mr Benson thought of this half the night through, and ended by determining to write a sermon on the Christian view of political duties, which might be good for all, both electors and member, to hear on the eve of an election; for Mr Donne was expected at Mr Bradshaw's before the next Sunday, and, of course, as Mr and Miss Benson had settled it, he would appear at the chapel with them on that day. But the stinging conscience refused to be quieted. No present plan of usefulness allayed the aching remembrance of the evil he had done that good might come. Not even the look of Leonard, as the early dawn fell on him, and Mr Benson's sleepless eyes saw the rosy glow on his firm, round cheeks, his open mouth, through which the soft, long-drawn breath came gently quivering, and his eyes not fully shut, but closed to outward sight. Not even the aspect of the quiet, innocent child could soothe the troubled spirit. Leonard and his mother dreamt of each other that night. Her dream of him was one of undefined terror so great that it wakened her up, and she strove not to sleep again, for fear that ominous, ghastly dream should return. He, on the contrary, dreamt of her sitting, watching, and smiling by his bedside, as her gentle self had been many a morning; and when she saw him awake, so it fell out in the dream, she smiled still more sweetly, and bending down she kissed him, and then spread out large, soft, white feathered wings, which in no way surprised her child. He seemed to have known they were there all along, and sailed away through the open window far into the blue sky of a summer's day. Leonard wakened up then, and remembered how far away she really was, far more distant and inaccessible than the beautiful blue sky to which she had betaken herself in his dream, and cried himself to sleep again. In spite of her absence from her child, which made one great and abiding sorrow, Ruth enjoyed her seaside visit exceedingly. In the first place, there was the delight of seeing Elizabeth's daily and almost hourly improvement. Then, at the doctor's express orders, there were so few lessons to be done, that there was time for the long exploring rambles which all three delighted in; and when the rain came on and the storms blew, the house, with its wild sea views, was equally delightful. It was a large house, built on the summit of a rock, which nearly overhung the shore below. There was, to be sure, a series of zigzag tacking paths down the face of this rock, but from the house they could not be seen. Old or delicate people would have considered the situation bleak and exposed. Indeed, the present proprietor wanted to dispose of it on this very account; but by its present inhabitants this exposure and bleakness was called by other names, and considered as charms. From every part of the rooms they saw the grey storms gather on the sea horizon, and put themselves in marching array. And soon the march became a sweep, and the great dome of the heavens was covered with the lurid clouds, between which, and the vivid green earth below, there seemed to come a purple atmosphere, making the very threatening beautiful; and by the house was wrapped in sheets of rain, shutting out sky and sea and inland view, till of a sudden the storm was gone by, and the heavy raindrops glistened in the sun as they hung on leaf and grass, and the little birds sang east, and the little birds sang west, and there was a pleasant sound of running waters all abroad. "Oh, if papa would but buy this house!" exclaimed Elizabeth, after one such storm, which she had watched silently from the very beginning. of the "little cloud no bigger than a man's hand."